I'm Magnus Walker and I've been obsessed with Porsche for the past 45 years. I've built, collected, driven, raced and restored quite a few P cars in my time. But this show is all about other people's Porsches. So take a ride along with me as I find out all there is to know about OPP. Today I'm behind the wheel of the Caretakers 959. I picked this car up earlier on today in Hollywood at 6:30 a.m. and drove in rush hour traffic across LA, down the 101, through downtown, onto the 5 and up the 2. And what I will say is, the car is so usable. It's like any 911, it's just ergonomically correct. The seating position, the visibility, the ease that you can operate, the controls, slicing and dicing through LA's rush hour morning traffic with commuters looking at their cell phones and big rig drivers not letting you in. The beauty of the 959 is you can slice and dice, it's easy to maneuver, and visibility is great. Recently I drove a 992 GT3, which, yes, it's an awesome car in its own right, but with that big wing, it's blocking the rear sightline right in the mirror. The 959 has none of that. It's complete familiarity with anything 911. In a way, at these speeds under 3,000 RPM, it doesn't feel any different to a 3.2 Carrera of that era. The controls are easily planted. But I will say the first impression when I got in the car, I wasn't sure if to get it starting in the G Galant all-terrain off-road gear or whatever Porsche calls it, or the standard dogleg 901 first, which is down and to the left. I will say when I started in the dogleg stock first, the first thing was the biting point of the clutch is really high. The pedal travels all the way down, but it doesn't bite until you're with 1 inch of the top travel. And I will say the stock first gear is pretty tall. You do have to give it a little bit of revs, and at one point I was going up a hill in bumper to bumper traffic, and I found it was easier to modulate in the G ratio gear. But anyway, enough about that. A couple of details on the 959. In the early 80s, the sort of future of the 911 was in doubt. Porsche was thinking the flagship 928 may actually replace the iconic 911. The then president main guy, Peter Schultz, wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he knew he had to save the 911. In stepped Helmut Bott, who basically said, hey, we need to develop the 911 into a future supercar, and I've got the perfect idea. Let's enter it into Group B rallying, which was home to the Audi Quattros and Lancer 037s and Ford Cozzies. The only catch was really they had to homologate 200 of them. But the project was green-lit. Jürgen Barth was on board. Hans Lepine was on board as chief designer. And by 1983, 20 years after the debut of the iconic 911, at the Frankfurt Auto Show, Porsche debuted the Group B study, which would later become the 959. Obviously, the silky silhouette of the shape of the car wooed the crowds at the Frankfurt Auto Show. But the real whiz-bang was a technological step forward, leap forward in fact, to four-wheel drive, double wishbone suspension, an active ride height which could raise or lower the car a max of 8 inch for when they were going off-roading. So the project was greenlit and the car was in development. Unfortunately, a lot of these new systems weren't available off the shelf, and with Porsche, perfection is always the goal, along with race on Sunday, sell on Monday. So from the beginning though, the Group B development was really taking a lot of time. And then fast forward 2 years down the road to the Frankfurt Auto Show 2 years later in 1985. By this time the car was almost ready to go on sale. It had been redubbed the 959. But Porsche had invested so much money into the development of the car that they were losing money on every car they took orders for. In the end, over a 3-year run, 87, 88, 89 production run, Porsche would go on to sell 345 of these cars, split into the majority of them being comfort cars. with a small amount of them being stripped out S-Class cars. And then for some strange reason, in true Porsche fashion in the early 90s, they found a bunch more parts and built 8 more of them. So that is the story of the development originally of the 959. But I'm going to drop it a cog, get down a second, and push it up the hill a little bit. It's amazing how tight it is and how well it corners. You have to imagine the majority of this technology is actually almost 40 years old, but the car still feels modern. But it's analog. There are computers all around doing stuff, but they're not invasive. You know, it's still a car where you get in, you just turn the key, put the clutch in, blip the throttle, select a gear, and off you go. So the greatest thing about the 959 is right behind this pull lever here, which will be real familiar to any 911 guy. Under this rear integrated wide body lies the heart and soul of the 959. The 2.85 litre sequential twin turbocharged engine, derived from the 956 and 962, has air-cooled cylinders but water-cooled heads, the first for a 911, pumping out 445 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. The engine will rev all the way to its limit of 8,000 RPM, but the greatest thing about the sequential inline turbos is it has more bottom end torque, 50% more than the equivalent turbo of the era at 3,000 RPM. As you can see here in true Porsche practicality, everything is packaged really neatly. Recently I drove an F40. You can't just open the hood on an F40. You have to mess around with this spindly little lever. But enough about that. Where you really feel the power in the 959, unlike similar turbos of the era, is that bottom end mid-range torque, which comes on way earlier than it would in a regular single turbo of that era. You have to remember in 1986-87, all you could buy from Porsche in a 911 was a 3.2 Carrera or a turbo. It's not like it is today where there's 47 varieties of the 911 or 992. And this was the pinnacle of that Group B evolution, the 959. Unfortunately, development took so long though, that by the time the car was ready, Group B was over. Deemed too reckless, too dangerous. So what Porsche decided to do was take the 959 to the Paris-Dakar. In '84, they'd explored a four-wheel drive setup, non-turbocharged, on a 3.2 litre SCR, and they'd done pretty well. In fact, they actually won. So Helmut Bott and Jürgen Both didn't really have to twist Jackie Ickx's arm too much to enter the 959 into the '86 and '87 Paris-Dakar. That was the first time a four-wheel drive twin turbocharged Porsche had actually competed in the Paris-Dakar, and they did really, really well. I love how tight the car is and how well it shifts. It's a short throw, but it's super precise. The brake pedal is real firm. The other first for this car was ABS all-round four-wheel drive, 17-inch center-lock hollow spoke Speedline wheels with specific Bridgestone beadlock run-flat tires. Part of the challenge was the car's actually pretty heavy. It's well over 3,000 pounds with all the technology that's in it and the four-wheel drive system. It's got AC, it's got heated seats. And one of the challenges was finding a tire manufacturer that could actually produce a compound that would hold up at almost 200 miles an hour. In comfort form, the car never made it to 200, but it got to 197 or 198, depending on who you're talking to. So the 959, it's not the most nimble 911 I've been in. You do feel the almost 3,500 pounds or whatever that max curve weight is, especially here on this little twisty section of the crest. You know, it's not quite as sharp and precise as an early, short wheelbase car, obviously, or even a long hood. And you really really got to keep the revs up to sort of feed in the power. It is throttle modulation. And the gear ratios are pretty tall. This is second gear right here. Normally I'm doing this section in third. And I am working up a bit of a sweat, even with the AC on. It does sound good though. That's like the second wave that comes on there between 5 and 6. And I think on the crest it's all about gear selection, obviously, like always. I mean, this is way better than my 3-liter 75 turbo with those really tall 4-speed ratios. You know, ultimately this I think is an Autobahn GT car. You know, it's 200, almost 200 miles an hour. You can only achieve that on a long open stretch of road. We're not seeing those speeds in the crest. Like all things great, the 959 covers all the senses. I say it all the time, you're really engaged, you hear it, you feel it, you smell it, you probably taste it. You know, it's got that Porsche smell, the leather. These are rolling in some pseudo sport seats. It doesn't have the typical 3 shades of silver gray that I have seen in other 959s. Apparently this is one of the first 20 cars that Caterpillar converted back in 2003. He's since done a lot more of them. Suspension upgrades, power upgrades. Compared to its predecessor, the Carrera GT, the 959 actually seems really docile. The Carrera GT is one of those really unnerving, unsettling cars with so much performance. It's only really experienced way up the rev band of power delivery. You always got to be guarded in a Carrera GT, looking way ahead, fully focused. The 959 is not quite that sharp. It is easy to left foot brake in it, my favorite thing. It does, I feel, like to be above 4,000 RPM all the time. So that does come back on a road like this to gear selection, mostly second, third, fourth, occasionally fifth. You can feel the car. It's planted, it's absorbing the sort of washboard asphalt here. I always find the crest is a great shakedown for any car because you got all different types of corners, high speed, slow speed. You got washboard surface, really sort of shows the shock absorption of the suspension. Trying to keep the contact patch on the ground at all times. So this is the second 959 I've ever driven. The first one was also silver. That was a Brumos owned Helmut Bot prototype, one of 12 cars that were made for development and prototype between 83 and 86, you know, when it went from Group B to the 959. But here it kind of feels laggy. 4,000 RPM, I'm not feeling that boost really coming in. Granted, I don't have my pedal to the metal. As I'm taking a bit of caution, as this is OPP, other people's Porsches, I always have to treat that with a little bit of respect. If you read the stats from 1986, they claim the 959 did 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. But I think the only way they achieved that was a very aggressive clutch dump, probably with the pedal mashed and the revs up at 5,000 RPM. In real world driving situations, the 0 to 60 is not 3.6 seconds. But compared to a 3.2 Carrera of 87 or a 3-liter 930 or 3.3 930 of 87, a 959 is a lot quicker. Due to less turbo lag, Porsche really solved that problem with the sequential turbo, developing more boost further down. and more bottom end torque. So by today's standards, it's not necessarily the quickest accelerating car, and 445 horsepower today is entry level on almost everything. But we got to go back to 1986. These numbers were very impressive back then. And I would say the 959 has definitely stood the test of time. It's not about being the fastest car on the road for me. It's more about the enjoyment. I always talk about it. The smiles per mile, really the memorable moments behind the wheel. And on my 2 occasions behind the wheel of a 959, both have been really memorable for different reasons. For me, it's a true joy to be behind the wheel of the legendary, iconic 959. If I'm going to nitpick it, the steering wheel. This has always sort of been my least favorite Porsche steering wheel. I'm kind of surprised the folks out there in Stuttgart didn't actually come up with a cooler wheel. Sure, it feels good in your hands. It's the same wheel you've got on a 3.2 Carrera. But talking of the 959, there was a lot of man hours involved, and the early production was just 60 people. These cars were not built on the regular Stuttgart production line. They were actually sent out and hand assembled. It took over 1,200 hours to put one together. So that on top of all the expensive technology or cost of developing the technology, the 4-wheel drive system, the active suspension, the double wishbone, and everything else this car has, you know, the plastic, fiberglass, Kevlar, composite panels, they're all unique to the 959. They weren't interchangeable. You know, and to me, I can really see the 959 DNA in the entire 911 line right now. And I can really see it in the 993, ironically. This obviously led the way, or paved the way, for the 964C4, Porsche's first real affordable production 4-wheel drive car. But that wouldn't have happened without the 959. Once again, Porsche always chasing perfection. And the 959 is the pinnacle of it. Today, just as it was 35 years ago.